start policy board in 2 minutes. All right, I'd like to call the ISFMP policy board meeting to order. To order. Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm going to try to get us back on schedule. We're late. It is my fault, so I apologize for that. You have an agenda for this morning's proceedings. We have our agenda. We also have our proceedings from our October annual meeting. Are there any corrections, modifications to the minutes, or any additional items for the agenda that anyone would like to bring forward at this time? Seeing none, without objection, the agenda and the proceedings are approved. Thank you very much. This is a time in our agenda where we ask for public comment. I do not have anyone signed up to speak. Is there anyone that would like to address the ISFMP Policy Board? Hey, Margot. Seeing none, we will move on to our first agenda item, which will turn it over to Tony Kearns to discuss voting procedures used by the Northern Shrimp section. Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to quickly go through some information, and then I'll pass it off to Terry from the recommendations from the state of Maine. The charter gives us guidance on how each of our boards follow procedures, and it states that we follow the Roberts Rules of Order, and that each state on a board or section has one vote for boards and sections, and that we also have votes for our federal partners. In sections, we do not have federal partners sitting on those boards. And the Northern Shrimp section is made up of only 3 states, and so there were concerns raised at this section by one of the states of whether or not voting was the appropriate method to carry out its business. And so there was a question of whether or not they should go work by consensus instead of voting. And so, Terry, I will let you go from there.
Yeah, thank you, Tony, for the lead-in. As Tony indicated, at our last shrimp section meeting, we initiated a PID for a limited entry program for Northern Shrimp. This is about, the public hearings are just about to be scheduled. I believe the first one will be at the Maine Fishermen's Forum at the 1st of March. But there are at this point, there are 2 primary issues in the document, one of which is limited entry and the other is a state-by-state allocation. Each of these 2 primary components could significantly impact one of the 3 states, particularly limited entry in the state of Maine, which our state legislature has very much taken a position on. If there's going to be a limited entry, they would like to do it on their own and not have it remanded from the commission. So in discussion I've had with Tony and Pat and others is because a majority vote might put 2 states against 1 state, whether or not we should look at a 3-state section as a consensus vote. And I don't have an answer, but I just would like to bring it to the attention of the board here that when we do come down to a final vote here, we might have state against state.
Dennis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We did have this discussion at the last meeting, but I would say that this issue isn't brought to you by a consensus of the 3 states involved in the shrimp section. Keep that clear. And I'm speaking as the vice chair of that section who will be taking over in the fall, and I hate to think of myself having to do business by achieving consensus. I have before me the definition of consensus decision-making, which is a group decision-making process that seeks the consent of all participants. I think if we do want to discuss consensus decision-making, instead of restricting this conversation to the shrimp section because of its size, we should expand it to the herring section, which has 6, some of the South Atlantic boards who probably have a limited number of folks. I don't think the policy board should be determining whether the shrimp section should be operated differently than the other boards and sections. We eventually, at all times, reach a point where we have to vote. And I think that our vote is important, and I don't think that one state's position should override any other state's position by wanting to achieve consensus. I think it would be difficult at times to achieve consensus, but in the shrimp section, which I've served on for 18 years, it has been the common practice of that section when they meet to always huddle up in the back of the room and make the hard decisions through a consensus form, though it's not formalized. But I think the intent of the 3 states has been to reach consensus, and I think we've done that fairly well. We also do that in herring when we set the landing days. So I just don't think that the policy board should be dictating to the shrimp section a change in our policy. So I do not favor this idea at all. Thank you.
Paul?
Yeah, I agree with just about everything that my colleague from New Hampshire has just stated. I think it's very true. If you open the door here for northern shrimp, then you would almost have to consider the same type of rule, policy, condition for everything else that we do. And I almost think that the type of the majority vote that we have, it allows groups that are voting, that have a voting privilege, that might have less of a stake in fishery, to be objective about what really needs to be done. And it's almost like removing objectivity from the decision process by going to a consensus. So I'm against that in this case. I'd also like to point out, for those of you who don't know, that the northern shrimp section is it is the longest running management program in this commission, and it's successfully running, and it's gone uninterrupted in this interstate process longer than any other similar type of management process in the nation, I believe. So it's got something it's doing right, and I like to see it continue unchanged. So.
Richie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Agree with everything the previous 2 speakers have said, and I would just add that going to consensus would then give the power to the minority in that process, because you'd be forced into status quo or not making any changes if one state would not go along. So, and that's not how this commission works. And the idea of pitting states against states, unfortunately, that is part of this process, and states have to look out for their own interests, and I think we do that pretty well here, keeping the resource as number 1. And I think the history of our actions on the shrimp section show that when we don't always quite come to consensus, we come very close. And I know New Hampshire in past years has definitely moved substantially from what they really wanted to see to try to accommodate the state of Maine when there was a push for additional harvest. So I think that even though it might not formally be a consensus, I think we already work pretty close to that. Thank you.
Tom?
I served 18 years on the policy committee of the Barnegat Bay Estuarine Program, been on the advisory committee for 22 years. And in the beginning of that program, I had to sit through 5 days of how you do everything by consensus, because EPA runs these programs as consensus building. But the reason they do that is because there's a lot of different goals by the people sitting around the table. You have the builders, you have the politicians, you have the public, you have the environmental groups, you have the fisheries groups. So you want to get consensus before you move forward, because any policy we put out would have to get the support of those groups from the estuarine program. This is a different situation. When we come to a herring section or northern shrimp section, there's no divergency. You're there to build the sustainable stocks. You're there to make healthy stocks go, and you're there to allow fishermen to basically harvest it if they can. So it's not really a consensus situation. I have no problem. It's different with the caucus, because caucus was the state getting together in the caucus, but it's different in the section. So I agree with staying with the same model that we've used for the last 20-something years or 30 years.
Based on the discussion around the table, is there any interest in taking any action on this issue? Not taking action maintains the current strategy on dealing with northern shrimp. Seeing no interest, we will move on. The next is a discussion. Shanna's going to lead us on a discussion of updating the roles and responsibilities of the Committee on Economics and Social Science.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as a SES coordinator, I wanted to speak with the board today about a few ideas that the committee had to update some of our roles and responsibilities and hopefully improve the socioeconomic information that we can provide you. After I'm done reviewing the suggestions that we have, I'm going to pass the baton over to Bob, and he's going to discuss what our options are moving forward. So to start, I wanted to briefly go through the Commission's guiding documents in regards to socioeconomics. In both ACFICMA and the Striped Bass Act, there are no requirements outlined in regards to fisheries socioeconomics. However, in the ISFMP Charter, we do recognize the importance of socioeconomics and state that these impacts and benefits must be taken into account with our management program. So last year, the board discussed having SES carry out a socioeconomic case study. After discussing potential topics of interest with the SES, we decided the best way to pursue this was to actually create an RFP and contract independent researchers. One of the reasons being is the point that Madeline has made during her last presentation to the board, which is that SES membership is really unlike any other ASMFC committees. SES is comprised entirely of volunteers, which makes it hard for them to have time and resources available to perform in-depth analyses for the Commission. So this led me to a new idea where I thought that maybe SES could take on a role as a steering committee. We would then be able to form guidance for the policy board towards specific socioeconomic issues. SES can then help the board pinpoint any significant socioeconomic data gaps with ASMFC species, and we can select the appropriate consultants or researchers to collect or analyze data. In the next few slides, I'm going to focus on the specific proposed changes to the language of the SES's guiding documents. I've listed the current language in the handouts that you should all have in front of you, as well as highlighted the proposed changes as well that I'll go through on these slides. So to start off, one of our first suggested changes is to make sure that the scientists who are SES members that serve as ASMFC species representatives are actually SES members. Previously, some of the scientists that were appointed to serve on the TCs or PDTs were not necessarily SES members, even though they were social scientists. We did find that this caused a large disconnect between the SES and the species committees. So moving forward, we think that it's very important to make sure that those members are actually SES members and they serve on TCs and PDTs. Another new idea that we had was to have species SES representatives be able to form task forces or subcommittees if there appears that there's going to be a significant management action for a specific species. Then we can have multiple members assisting with the socioeconomic sections of new amendments and provide different regional perspectives. So previously, SES members were required to appoint one social scientist and one economist to each species. That was about a total of 42 SES representative slots to fill, while our committee maxes out at 23 members. When I was going through the list, I noticed that some members were responsible for up to 4 species, which really did not allow them time to frequent many TC or PDT calls. SES proposes that we change that language to only nominate one member for each species, TC or PDT, so that each member of our committee can only cover 1 to 2 species. And this way it'll give them time to devote more attention. Some of our high-profile species have obviously generated more interest, so more than one member can serve on those committees if they so choose. SES members will then be added to TC mailing lists as the socioeconomic representative and will read through agendas or meeting topics as well as communicate with the FMP coordinators to determine if they should be present to identify pertinent socioeconomic issues. We know that PDTs will probably require more participation than the TCs. However, TC calls can also provide the biological rationale for management. We also propose that on a yearly basis, SES members will meet to report out on their individual species assignments, which should help to keep the committee informed of any significant upcoming management actions or PDT formations. This way, all of SES is able to have a more active knowledge of ASMFC species and the socioeconomic issues that they're facing. These yearly meetings should also help to inform the socioeconomic research needs list that we would like to present to the Commission. At least every 3 years, we propose that SES prepare a report that should outline what they view as the greatest critical gaps in socioeconomic knowledge for the ASMFC. This report can help to guide the ASMFC socioeconomic RFPs and future data collection. As the board chooses appropriate socioeconomic data collection or analysis initiatives, the SES can then create the RFPs for distribution. The SES will then decide what the appropriate parties are to distribute the RFPs, review the proposals, and then decide where to distribute funding. It also seemed that after our workshop during annual meeting, the board was very interested in having similar educational activities. We'd like to add language to our guiding document outlining what we can provide in the way of educational workshops to help maintain member awareness on relevant socioeconomic topics. We can then create these activities by request to ensure that they are of interest to the ASMFC. So finally, this is a list of our current membership, and our last suggestion is to change the language of our membership slightly. Currently, the guidelines read that SES is required to have only one representative from each of the 15 states, as well as 8 federal members. Since SES is unique in that membership is comprised of volunteers, we've actually had interest in people joining our committee outside of those limitations. We'd like to expand the membership to include up to 5 additional members who are willing to serve on the committee as our species liaisons. We hope that this should add minimal cost to our travel budget while still not turning away willing volunteers. And so with that, I'm going to open the floor to Bob, and he's going to go over our discussion points and outline what our steps are moving forward.
Sorry. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Shanna. I think there's a slide that's about to pop up. It's got a little delay going. Moving forward, as Shanna mentioned, there's limited guidance in the charter recognizing the importance of socioeconomics. The Atlantic Coastal Act and Striped Bass Act don't have any direct language that forces the Commission's hand in this issue. In the past, the Commission has obviously relied heavily on the knowledge of the folks sitting around this table. As we were going into the Menhaden FMP, their Amendment 2 discussions and considering a 20% reduction, it was, there's ample discussion on the socioeconomic impacts at the board level. Jack Travelstead, who's in the audience now, provided the impacts to the omega protein folks, and the public comment opportunities and public hearings that we had highlighted the socioeconomic impacts, as well as a few hundred individuals in the back of the room with the yellow sign highlighted the impacts of the socioeconomic impacts. So the question is, how does the commission want to handle socioeconomic information in the future? Some of our FMPs have had limited sections on socioeconomics and the sort of basic economic impacts and value of fisheries. Very seldom have we done extensive analyses and studies on socioeconomic impacts, and that's a resource issue and a timing issue. It takes a lot of time to do that. Question before the commission is essentially, as you went through the striped bass decision that was just made, would that have been a better decision if we had put a lot of resources and significant time into developing socioeconomic analysis to include in the draft document that went out for public comment? And I'm not, that's up for the group to decide. But it would have slowed the decision down. It probably would have, you would not have affected the 2015 fishery. You probably would have at best affected the 2016 fishery. That's a big difference. The socioeconomics that have been characterized by at least one commissioner as a tie-break kind of a situation where if you have two options that are essentially equal or a push on biology, maybe economics then weigh into deciding which is a better option. That's one way to look at it. There's always a struggle of the priority between economics and biology, and that's just the nature of the business that you guys are in. So I think, those are the questions up on the slide. The questions, it's a two-part question. What do you guys want in the FMPs? What should those sections look like? And that, some of these decisions may require adjustments to the charter, which is fine. We just need to clarify that. But, what do the sections in the FMPs look like? Are they just simple value of fisheries? How much dollars or, ex-vessel value is generated by menhaden or lobster or striped bass or whatever it may be? And, what's the estimated overall recreational impact for some species? That, those type of things are relatively easy, but comprehensive socioeconomic studies like the ones that were presented at the annual meeting are amazingly informative, but they take some time. And they explore trade-offs between different management options and those sorts of things. And the next level of that question is: do you want to continue to rely on commissioner expertise, or do you want to use some of the CES expertise or outside contractors to work on that? And then, as Shanna mentioned earlier, what is the CES role in this sort of new approach to handling socioeconomic information? Do they actually do the work at the Committee for Economics and Social Sciences, or are they more of a steering committee that finds contractors to do the work? There's budget impacts there, but I think they're all viable options. It's just really the priorities and trade-offs of the commissioners and how you want to handle it. We did, since the annual meeting when we had the discussion with Madeline Harbour and Jorge when they came in and presented the options, there were two things that came up. One is an appeal from the state of Delaware on the striped bass decision, and one of their main concerns in that appeal was socioeconomics. And felt that it wasn't fully explored in the draft addendum that went out for public hearing. And the other thing that came up was a letter from the governor from the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that letter brought up similar questions and concerns about socioeconomics. So there is clearly an increasing focus on socioeconomics, but how does, given the resources available to you all, how do you want to move forward, and what do you want to include in your FMPs are essentially the two questions, and then the third is how does CES fit into this? So I think that's the background, Louis, and it's up to however you want to handle it.
Don't everybody raise their hand at once. All right, Mr. Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And John.
My question goes to the word rely. Apparently, what this would do is put in a section in an FMP that would say this is the social and economic situation based on this particular proposed plan. But I don't believe it actually forces the board to go with it. I think this is right. This is just another picture to look at while we consider. Is that basically where this would go if they did have this particular thing in an FMP?
Well, I think think yes. It would provide more information for the commission on the impacts of the decision that they're making. But again, it's like having worked with the councils, and the councils have, at least from my experience, they have an economist, they have an anthropologist, they have folks that are going out and doing these community surveys, they're doing community outreach, they're looking at the social and the economic consequences of the fishery, what the dependency of the communities on the fishery and the like. But one of the big questions comes down to when the rubber meets the road, how is that information used to end overfishing and rebuild stocks? Traditionally, it's not used. And so I think there's an awareness there of the impacts, but we're not going to fail to take the necessary biological information into account because it may have an impact. We know reductions are going to have an impact. And that's kind of some of the discussion that we had about the appeal from Delaware, and I'll go to John next to let him respond to that. But, like Bob said, if you've got two, and the way I've always understood it at the federal level, if you've got two equal alternatives for reducing overfishing, and one is more economically advantageous to our constituents than the other, that's what you pick. But other than that, you don't say, well, we're not going to end overfishing because it's going to have an economic consequence. So I think the question for the commission, Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, don't hesitate, but the question to the commission is the Magnuson Act requires socioeconomic analysis of their management actions, and they are held to a very high standard there. We are not. And so recognizing how that information has been used at the council level, how much effort, how much money, how much time do we want to allocate to determining these social and economic consequences with our limited staff, both at home and at the commission level. And so I think that may fairly broach the question, Bill. I think your points are your questions are excellent. So I think that's a very difficult decision from a political standpoint. I mean, we don't want to say we don't care about the economic consequences of our actions. I don't think anybody is saying that. But at what level do they enter into the decision-making process? And how much information do we need to have on the table to make our decision? John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Dave and Stephen.
I might be misremembering, but I thought the Striped Bass Conservation Act did require an economic analysis to be submitted to Congress by 1998, but that's not my main point. As you mentioned, we in Delaware were asked to appeal the decision, and much of that appeal was based on the lack of an economic analysis in the addendum. I don't think we need to get into a full detailed market analysis of everything. I think what a lot of our commercial fishermen in particular were concerned about was the fact that we knew there would be impacts to them. We did not even acknowledge that in this addendum. Obviously, the recreational fishery is going to take a strong impact also, but the commercial impact would have been very easy to calculate. For example, in Delaware, I can calculate based on the average price of striped bass that each of our fishermen is going to lose about $1,600 a year. Assuming this plan is in place for at least 3 years, that's about $5,000, which to a lot of these guys, that's a substantial part of their income that they make from fishing. I think they would have really just appreciated that we acknowledged that we had looked at that when we made this decision, that we were aware of this, and I think the states could get some of this data very simply because we know how much our fishermen are getting. We know even the recreational business in the states, and I think, as I said, if we can at least acknowledge that in the addendums, it would go a long way to at least making these impacts, the people that are affected by this feel that we're taking that into consideration when we do these addendums. And as far as the commercial quotas go, I think they're all pretty realistic in realizing that under Amendment 6, we had a population that was completely recovered. It was probably at a historical high. They're not going to see the commercial quotas go higher than where they were. So the loss they're taking under this addendum will never be made up in those terms. We can tell them that if we didn't do this, well, you wouldn't have anything to catch in a few years. But as I said, it's more of a question, I think, of acknowledging that we understand the impacts that the various sectors are going to have to withstand under these addendums. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom?
When we looked over the years, for many years, been looking at the socioeconomic impact, covered in the Mid-Atlantic plans and a lot of the plans. On the recreational side, it always says this will not have a substantial effect on the recreational fishery. We always ask, where's the socioeconomic data to prove that, and never got an answer. So unless we're going to really do something that truthfully does something and look at it, there's no sense of putting a paragraph in the plan unless you're going to do the research necessary. What I think is more important is to look at certain factors. I mean, when I started digging into a lot of the trip limits and everything that went on last year, and I looked at it and saw that the Mid-Atlantic region has went down 8 million trips in the since 2007. That's a place we should be looking at. That's a trend. That's a lot of money being lost in that region, and we should find out what's affecting that. We also should have some kind of guideline on certain species, which is more economically important, size, bag limit, or seasons, because that could help in a decision, which means, do we make the season long and raise the size? Which has the biggest economic impact on the recreational side? Those are some of the answers. I'm not looking for I would love to have that, but I knew we don't have the resources. I mean, one time, New Jersey actually had an economist, Dr. Brown, on staff. And as soon as he retired, we decided it was a non-job anymore, as everybody else retires in New Jersey and they don't replace them. The same thing happened with Dr. Brown. So with the limited resources that we have, we should be looking at things that really affect us. Why has New Jersey dropped 2 million trips? Why has the rest of the states dropped 8 million trips in the last 8 years? We have ideas. We have, was it the gas prices, whether it was the economy, whether it was up in regulations, or people just get frustrated when they can't catch legal fish. We should understand that, because this has a huge economic impact of the state. I mean, I don't know what it's cost us. And what's the most amazing part, even with all those drops of 8 million trips, we're still catching with with less number of boats. Like in New Jersey, I think it's down 80,000 boats. We're still catching the same amount of fish with less trips and less boats. But that's another fallacy that I can't figure out.
Thank you, Tom. Dave Simpson?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. My preference is to stay with the simple approach that we've been using. I feel that in all our decisions, I've had a good sense of what the economic implications are of any of our decisions. I felt pretty informed, on striped bass, what the implications were short-term and long. And on menhaden as well, I felt I had a really good understanding of what our FMP meant to the Commonwealth of Virginia, to omega protein in particular, to the bait fisheries, and I don't see a 500-page document for each one of these really helping form my opinion or refining my opinion any further. We're also, at least 20 years into management for most of these species now, so we're not struggling with that initial, is it going to be worth it, the short-term economic losses for the long-term stability and long-term economic gains. We're well into this on most of our species. So I think I do think that appreciate the sensitivity from certain aspects, certain segments of the industry to, hey, remember us out there, and maybe there wasn't as much of that discussion at the table as there could have been, perhaps, but I think we all, as a political body, we are taking that into account. And I hope your fishermen do appreciate that we do consider that. We know a 25% cut in a state who fully utilizes their quota means something. We can all, multiply at least by $4 a pound and say we understand that. So I don't think there's a lot to be gained by, spending a lot of time and effort. And in fact, I think it's only going to, as Bob alluded to, it's only going to cause us to delay a decision that gets us on with conservation and long-term economic benefits.
Mr. Train.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. David Simpson said a lot of what I was thinking. If we're going to do an economic impact statement with our actions, we got to go all in to get it. I mean, economic impact always has a negative connotation. Every one of us around here knows every decision we make has an economic impact. But the economic impact in the long term should be positive if we're doing our job, not negative. And we can't just put a small statement with our actions saying the immediate economic impact is X, when 5 or 6 or 8 years down the road, it should be a benefit to everybody, and the impact should be positive. So in my opinion, to do this, I mean, we've got to go full bore and show the long-range benefits to the coastal communities of everything we do, and not the immediate negative to an action we're taking to keep F at M and whatever. Because as the stocks rebuild, harvest levels should increase and the economic benefit should be positive. I don't know if we have the manpower or the finances to go all in.
Or the forecasting ability. Good point. So, Doug Grout.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think some of the issues here are whether we want to have more quantitative economic assessment as opposed to the qualitative that we rely on. The other issue that we need to deal with is what kind of social economic impacts we put into our management documents. Clearly, in an addendum, we don't spend a lot of time on social economic impacts. On an amendment, we do have sections in there on social economic impacts, and to date, it's been mostly qualitative. In my experience with the councils, even with a very bright and quite frankly extensive staff compared to what we have on social economics, both at the Science Center and within the council, they produce, for some things, some very detailed quantitative economic impacts. On groundfish, they provide a tremendously high-level quantitative impact on what the commercial fishery impacts to our regulations. But when we've been putting in changes to our recreational, they are still very qualitative, not quantitative. They don't have the information. And that's with a very large, bright, well-paid staff, from my opinion. So I'm not sure we're going to, given our resources, that we're going to be able to get much beyond a qualitative assessment in our social economic impacts. I think as far as the addendum versus the amendment, I think that's our job, is if we are foreseeing that a management action would have a substantial economic impact on one or more of our constituents, then maybe we need to think about whether we need to take the time and do a full-blown amendment as opposed to an addendum, and at least give some kind of qualitative impact to put a qualitative impact assessment within the amendment.
That's the kind of input I think we need for this discussion. We can discuss the merits of economic data for a couple of days. We've got 35 minutes to get through 3 agenda items. What I'm hearing primarily around the table is that we recognize that we're not going to be able to do these quantitative analyses on socioeconomics, that we want to have some recognition of the economic impacts of our decisions, but recognize that that's going to be qualitative. So I'm not sure how much more discussion we need to have on that. I've got several other folks to speak, but please try to keep that in mind if you have recommendations or discussions. I'm not exactly sure what we want to come out of this with, and Bob, maybe you could kind of clarify again what result you would like.
I think your summary was great, Louis. It sounds like folks are settling on the notion of some basic information in documents that we can pull together at the PDT level, interacting with the CES representatives on things like ex-vessel value, number of permits, those sorts of things. I think we can pull those together pretty quickly. That doesn't describe the impacts. It just lets folks know, kind of what's at stake and how many people are involved. But I think that does provide some valuable information to the folks around the table. We can, maybe we can pull together a short outline on what that might look like to bring back to the policy board in the May meeting. And I think there's probably the bigger role for CES is kind of on a special case basis. In other words, are there species where there are big allocation questions coming up or something along those lines where the board does want to take some time, do a larger economic analysis and ask the CES if they have the expertise, and if they don't, turn that over to a contractor of some sort. And, I just don't think, it doesn't seem anyway around the table that folks want to do an extensive economic analysis for every action the commission takes. I think there's some inherent understanding of what the impacts are and the inherent understanding of the resources that are available, and we just can't do that. So if we put very basic information in draft documents with the notion that, the big issues that pop up, menhaden, lobster, eels, whatever they might be, that do have a lot of economic impacts and may warrant some longer studies, then the commission asks the CES to get involved and tackle those sort of one-off projects rather than doing it for every FMP. That's kind of where I'm going anyway, based on this conversation and sort of reading between the lines.
Perhaps one of the comments that struck the chord with me more than any was Steve's regarding the expected benefits down the road, and it's kind of like you can pay me now or pay me later type of situation, where if we've got a stock that's in bad shape, we would hope that once that stock recovers, that those economic losses during the rebuilding period would be offset by the economic gains of a recovered fishery. I mean, that's why we're all here, right? So I've got 4 folks that are signed up to speak. Bob Ballou, Roy Miller, Richie White, and John Clark. If you could speak to those issues, and if you have objection to the direction that we're going in, I think we need to hear that, but we really need to move on to 2 additional topics. So, Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will be brief. I actually, what Bob Beal just articulated is very much what I was planning to offer. It is, in my view, in terms of how to best engage the CES, an issue of focusing them on the high priority management issues in advance of those issues being addressed by the board, perhaps coinciding, I should say, with the benchmark assessments as Menhaden now rolls forward, as Tautog perhaps is about to roll forward. It would be awesome to have that kind of comprehensive analysis before the board in parallel with the science, with the benchmark assessments, so that we're fully informed as we move forward. And Bob offered some excellent examples, eels, for example. I think that's where we want to really focus and target the work of the CES. I think we do not want to try to spread them too thin. So it's on those high priority issues, perhaps coupled with the benchmark assessments and upcoming major management actions, that I think we want to have them engaged. Thank you.
Thank you. Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having listened to Bob Beal's summary, I think we're headed in the right direction. But I would just like to point out that, let's face it, folks, we had the time to do a little bit of economic analysis with striped bass. We did not take that action at the annual meeting on short notice. We had the opportunity to gather some potential economic impacts, even as simple as what John articulated, and what would be the net economic loss to state's commercial fishermen on a per pound landed basis, that type of thing. Very basic information, not a full economic analysis, but an immediate, the recognition by the Commission that there's an immediate economic impact. For other species that we're going to discuss this week, like summer flounder, we've heard from our colleagues in New Jersey that there have been economic impacts from having a differential size limit in Delaware Bay. That's easy to say, but some substantiation of what that economic impact would be or was would be much more useful, I think, to everyone in this room, rather than stating that there, in fact, has been an economic impact. So I think we need to do something. I think Bob is heading us down the right road. We need to give at least some consideration for these major species where we're making major changes in catch allocations and allowable landings. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. Richie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Agree with the direction we're going, although I have grave concern over reallocation of financial resources to any degree in this direction. We struggle with getting stock assessments and peer review stock assessments in the timely manner that we want them. We don't have the financial resources to do them at the rate we'd like to do them. So I think this is all good if we can do it, but I don't want to see us take money away from a lot of those situations to fund this. Thank you.
Thank you, Richie. John Clark?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to be brief, I agree with what Bob said, the direction he wants to go in. I just would want to point out to Doug's point about the amendment. Amendment 6 does have one paragraph about social and economic benefits of the striped bass amendment. It's very, sacrifice now for the future. There's no specifics in there. I think also that we need to look at this almost on a case-by-case basis. In some species, like with this addendum, we were taking these cutbacks on a stock that was not overfished and overfishing was not occurring. I think we owe it to the public to tell them why we are doing this, why we are going to be taking action in those cases. Thank you.
All right. Shanna, is there anything we didn't discuss that you would like to?
I don't think so. I think that the end of the conversation is essentially what we're proposing. When we come forward with a list of socioeconomic data needs and present that to you on hopefully a 3-year basis, if we see that one of our major species is probably going to go through a major management action, that's at the point where the board can come to the SES and say, we'd like to develop an RFP. Here's the amount of funds that we have available, and the SES can work together to get that out, get that distributed, and start to look at the contractors and review proposals. So I think that you've answered pretty much all of my questions, and I think we're good to move forward.
Just a gut check, make sure we weren't just going around the table and not providing you with any direction that you needed. I do have just a couple of summaries. I think it is incumbent upon the states to recognize the specific economic consequences of a specific action the Commission takes. Being familiar with the council process, they're looking at the federal waters, and they're not really distinguishing. They do distinguish between states, but they're really looking at it from a more holistic standpoint, whereas we're looking at stocks throughout their range, but as individual state caucuses, we have a specific interest in our individual state, obviously. obviously. And some of these management actions are going to be more or less proportionate to the individual states. And so I think it's important for us as individual states to bring those issues to the table, recognizing that maybe the CES may not be able to give the level of complexity, the level of detail that you believe may be necessary for the decision-making process, so that we don't run into the problems that we've run into in the past where you didn't really understand these economic impacts that are going to occur. Well, I think to some degree that's our responsibility to try to make sure that we bring those to the table if we're not seeing it done to our satisfaction. Just a suggestion. So, nothing further on that issue. We've provided our guidance to the CES folks, and obviously we will hear more in future meetings on moving forward with that. Next item on the agenda is a review and consideration of comments for the HMS Shark Draft Amendment 6. Carol Brewster-Geis is here from the HMS section to provide us with an overview of that amendment, and this is an opportunity for us to provide comments.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everybody. As Louis said, my name's Carol Brewster-Geis. I'm here from the National Marine Fisheries Service, and we really appreciate the opportunity to present our Amendment 6 to our FMP to you. So I realize you are all under a very tight time constraint, so I am going to try to go through this very fast. If I'm going too fast, let me know. In the meantime, hold on to your hats and let's get going. So as many of you are aware, over the past few years, our shark fishermen have faced a lot of issues. Some of these issues are listed here. These challenges that they have faced have caused a number of shark fishermen to leave the fishery. So what we are trying to do in Amendment 6 is address some of these issues and allow for the shark fishermen to be able to make some profits, hopefully at least. So we are also trying to, however, continue rebuilding overfished shark species along with preventing overfishing. In addition, Amendment 6 considers two of the most recent stock assessments. These stock assessments were on bonnethead and sharp-nosed sharks. The assessments found that both of these two species have two stocks, one in the Gulf of Mexico and one in the Atlantic. For bonnethead sharks, for various reasons, the assessment results were rejected, so we have an unknown status for that species, whereas for sharp-nosed sharks, the status is not overfished and no overfishing is occurring within the Atlantic. So moving on to the alternatives, the first group of alternatives we considered was permit stacking. This is an idea that was raised by shark fishermen early on in this process for Amendment 6. Under permit stacking, if you had multiple permits, you would put them on one vessel and then could land multiple trip limits. We looked at this and decided not to move forward with any of the permit stacking alternatives. We felt while this would be advantageous for fishermen who have multiple permits, it would have severe disadvantages for those who only have one permit. Instead, we decided to move forward with commercial shark retention limit changes. A lot of fishermen and others agreed with this approach. The current trip limit is 36 large coastal sharks per trip. This is the same limit that this body has for state waters. So we would really appreciate your comments on this range of alternatives. If you remember, when we set up this retention limit back in 2008, it was set up as a balancing act with the shark research fishery, trying to balance the number of sandbar dead discards within the fishery. So as we increase the retention limit, we are expecting more dead discards of sandbar sharks. We would be reducing the shark research fishery quota. So we are preferring a trip limit of 55 large coastal sharks per trip. As I said, we would really appreciate your comments on this. And moving forward to the next slide. There we go. So the next group of alternatives is something that has come up numerous times in the Shark Board. This is change between regional and sub-regional quotas. This is a very big, hot topic. A lot of fishermen, particularly along the Atlantic, want to fish at different times of the year, depending upon when the sharks happen to be in their area, regarding their migratory patterns. So at the last Shark Board meeting, we had a large discussion on this. And I mentioned that this was coming through in here. So for the Atlantic region and quota, we looked at a number of alternatives. For the split for subregions, we looked at 33 degrees north latitude, which is the northern part of South Carolina, and we also looked at 34 degrees north latitude, which is the southern part of North Carolina. I hope I said that right. For landings history, for large coastals, we looked from 2008 to 2013. 2008 was when all the big changes happened in the shark fishery. The trip limit went into place, fins naturally attached, regional quotas, it's a whole bunch of things. So we tried to avoid anything that happened before those big changes. For small coastal sharks, we only looked at 2 years, 2011 and 2012. There was a big amendment in 2010 that changed some small coastal issues. And then in 2011, 2012, we had the full year of data, whereas in 2013, we did have some a closure in that fishery. In addition, for the Atlantic, we are proposing to modify some of the quota linkages for small coastal sharks. So this is the overall slide of what we are proposing. That proposed line for the subregions would be at 34 degrees north latitude. All the northern states would get approximately 20% of the aggregated large coastal, approximately 34% of the hammerhead. For the small coastal sharks, the black-nose quota turned out to be really small when we split it. It was less than a metric ton. So what we are proposing is no black-nose quota for the northern states. And then for the non-black-nose small coastals, about 30% of the quota. In the south, you would have just the opposite. There was a lot of black-nose quota, so that linkage would still exist for the southern states between black-nose and non-black-nose quotas. This group of alternatives, as I said, is a hot topic. It's something that has come up again and again at the Shark Board meeting. We'd really, really appreciate comments from all of the states on this. We have already been working closely with some of Lewis's staff who have been asking about how we came up with these numbers. So we are double checking all the calculations and would be happy to work with other states on the numbers. In addition to all of the regional splits and the quotas and how we split that, we're also looking at adjusting the total allowable catch and the overall quota for small coastal sharks based on those stock assessments. We are proposing to maintain the current base quota. We considered similar things for the Gulf. I am not going to go over those with you because I'm assuming most of you aren't interested. The last group of alternatives have to do with vessel upgrading restrictions, and we put these in place back in 1999 when we did limited access. Since then, with the trip limits, we are thinking we no longer need the upgrading restrictions, so we are proposing to remove them. The comment period for this proposed rule ends on April 3rd. We are hoping to have it effective this coming summer, so that's when the trip limits, the subregions, the new quotas would all go into place. We have a number of public hearings, so if you continue to have questions beyond what you might have here, feel free to go to the public hearings. And then I am here if any of you have questions or discussion points. Thank you.
Questions for Margot? Carol. Sorry, Margot. You want to come on up, Margot? Sorry. I should know better. No questions. Concerns? Wow. I'm not going to let you off the hook that easy.
It must be perfect.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you. The sub-regional quotas, you said that I think I saw the large coastal sharks that used data from, 2008 to 2013. Is that correct?
That is correct.
In those years, if I remember right, we had different opening dates. Is that correct?
That is also correct. So some of those years we opened early in the year, in January, and others we opened in June and July.
Is there any way to adjust those numbers to make them more equal?
We felt we had a good range since some of the time we opened early in the season, which meant those fishermen who would prefer to fish early had the opportunity, and those fishermen who fished later in the season had the opportunity when it did open late. So we feel like we have a good mix. But if you can think of another way that we could look at it, we would be more than happy to consider that.
Well, I guess a couple of comments. Concerns to some degree is that those fishermen that chose to fish earlier had areas to fish. And North Carolina, area, we did not have the choice to fish because the area was closed. So that's an issue. I do appreciate the work that the agency has done with our staff looking at the different ways in which the sharks are landed and the weights. And I suspect that if modifications need to be made, they'll be made. And that may adjust the northern area quota, which certainly impacts the North Carolina and the Mid-Atlantic fishery. Recognizing that the black-nosed sharks do tend to be caught more in Florida, and having that quota allocated exclusively to Florida and not having that linkage with small coastals in the North Carolina Mid-Atlantic region is, I think, a good move that does protect our small coastal fishery, which I think does in the northern region. So that's very positive, I think. One issue that has come up is the definition, and I believe this is in our ASMFC plan, but is the short line that's allowed to be 500 yards and 50 hooks, and whether or not there's opportunity either at the state level or the ASMFC level to modify that short line definition, since the new quota, since the new trip limits may be 55 sharks. It's going to be hard to catch 55 sharks on 50 hooks. So there may be some that we need to look at that, whether that's an issue that needs to be handled at the ASMFC plan level or at the federal level, or if that's just something that the states can make a modification to. There needs to be some clarification on that, and that may have impacts at least in North Carolina and Virginia, and I would certainly think in the southern areas as well if you're using short lines. So is there...
It's in their plan is the question.
Go ahead. If you could clarify that, that would be great.
So our FMP does not define how many hooks are on the long line. So the 50 hook, I believe, is in the ASMFC plan.
Yeah, it's us. So that's something that we probably need to look into to make some modifications to in our shark plan to provide more leniency, going from 36, a limit of 36 large coastals to 55 large coastals. The gear doesn't match up anymore, if that makes sense. I'm racking my brain trying to remember the other issues. This is always such a complicated issue when you're dealing with sharks. It is positive to have seen the bonnethead and the sharp-nosed assessments come back good. That does provide for a lot of opportunities in our nearshore coastal waters, and it does provide for some bycatch. I think one of one of the questions, certainly we just want to make certain that the allocation is fairly, distributed between the northern and the southern region, and that the difficulties in gutted weight versus whole weight, those types of issues are dealt with, and we get to the bottom of those issues before we go to the final rule. But not sure what the commission, the board might want to do in terms of submitting any comments on this. It sounds like to me that some of the issues really are more issues we need to deal with in our ASMFC plan. Rob?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Carol. I guess I just had a question first. Was it an indication that even though the bonnet head assessment said not overfished and overfishing not occurring, it was rejected? Is that what you indicated?
That's correct. The result of the bonnet head assessment was not accepted. And that's because the way the bonnet head assessment was done is it looked at the overall species and not the two individual stocks.
And if I may, so what is the follow-up, the remedy for?
We hope to do a benchmark for bonnet head at some point in the future. We have a lot of shark species that we need to assess, and at this point, that assessment is not yet scheduled.
Continue, Rob.
A little bit different. So the 20% north of the demarcation line, how does that stand relative to what the landings have been over the last 10 years? And you may have described that, but I'm not sure.
So that 20% was based off of the average landings from 2008 to 2013. So that has been how much the northern portion has been landing of the quota.
Anything else on the ever-popular shark fishery? Seeing none, is there interest in submitting comments on Amendment 6 from the Policy Board? Seeing none, we will move on. Individual states, I would encourage those individual states that have an interest in the fishery to review this with your staff and submit comments as necessary. And I want to thank Carol for being here and providing the information that we reviewed today. So with that, we will move on to review and consider approval of the 2015 weak fish stock assessment terms of reference. And Katie will lead us through that discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So these are based really on the standard generic ASMFC terms of reference, so I'll go through them fairly quickly. Just a reminder, the purpose of the TORs is to guide the TC and the Stock Assessment Subcommittee in developing the assessment and guide the review panel in reviewing it to make sure that we hit the important biological questions that we have to answer without constraining us too tightly to a particular method or approach. So we have one set for the TC and the Stock Assessment Subcommittee and one set for the peer review panel. So for the assessment, we are going to start out with characterizing the precision and the accuracy of the fishery-dependent and fishery-independent data used in the assessment, making sure we describe the data sources, making sure we justify the inclusion or elimination of any of those data sources. We are going to review evidence for constant or recent systematic changes in natural mortality, predator-prey dynamics, productivity, and or discard mortality. This one is special for weak fish because this has always been a big concern for this species, so we wanted to make sure that we got the issue of natural mortality on the TORs here. We're going to develop models to estimate population parameters, such as fishing mortality, biomass abundance, as well as biological reference points, and we're going to make sure we analyze the model performance with appropriate diagnostics. We are going to characterize the uncertainty of the model estimates and of the biological or empirical reference points. We're going to perform retrospective analyses to assess the magnitude and direction of the retrospective patterns and any implications on the assessment results. We will recommend stock status as it relates to those reference points if those reference points are available. For example, is the stock below the biomass threshold, or is F above the F threshold? We are going to develop detailed short and long-term research recommendations, as well as highlighting the improvements that need to be made by the next benchmark stock assessment, and we will recommend timing of the next benchmark assessment relative to the biology and current management of the species. So that's for the assessment. The peer review panel is basically going to just go through and evaluate all the work that we have done. So they will evaluate the data collection that we presented, as well as the treatment of the fishery independent and dependent data. They will evaluate the evidence for those changes in natural mortality, evaluate the methods and models used to estimate model parameters, as well as evaluating the diagnostic analyses and the methods used to characterize uncertainty in the stock assessment, as well as ensuring that the implications of uncertainty are clearly stated. If a minority report has been filed, they will review that minority report and the associated analyses and make recommendations on whether or not that should be used in management. They will recommend the best estimates of stock biomass, abundance, and exploitation, or specify alternative management measures if they do not approve the measures that we used. They will evaluate the choice of reference points and the methods used to estimate them, as well as recommend stock status based on either those methods or alternative methods. They will review the research recommendations that we present, as well as provide their own recommendations to improve the reliability of future assessments. They will recommend timing of the next benchmark assessment as well, and they will prepare a peer review panel report on these terms of reference. So that covers everything that we and they will be doing for this assessment.
Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Katie, I did not hear any plans for considering spatial considerations. We've listened to Lewis tell us how many weak fish there are in North Carolina and how few there are up north we're very familiar with. And we've always treated this as a single stock, and maybe it's time to relook at that particular aspect of the biology of the fish, and I didn't hear anything in that regard in terms of the terms of reference. Thank you.
So you're right, it's not specifically a term of reference. However, we have certainly received that input from our chair as well, and it's something the TC is already in the process of working on. If the board wishes to make it explicit in the terms of reference, I think we can work something out for that, but I think it's sort of covered under the evaluate the available fishery independent and dependent data and looking at some of the spatial concerns there. So it is something the TC is considering and working on.
Rob?
I think the terms of reference for the stock assessment subcommittee and for the peer review panel are fine, and I'm glad to see that after a bit of a delay, this is finally going forward. I think it's really important, as I mentioned a couple of years ago, just because there's a beleaguered stock doesn't mean the commission doesn't want to have the best information possible while even a slight rebuilding that may be starting blossoms a little bit more. So I think it's really important. On the stock discrimination issue, I did read that there may be some studies in the future to look at that. I know there are past studies that Shepard and Grimes did a study where they determined there were 3 stocks. With a split at the Bay and then a split at Ocean City, I think it was. There was also a VIMS PhD candidate that did a study, and of course there was the John Graves approach with mitochondrial DNA. So I think if anything happens in the future, it has to be something that's a little bit more. Dr. Jones from ODU has done work along with Simon Thorold, who's now with Woods Hole. So there have been a number of studies I think we can look at those again as we get through this assessment and, maybe see what else is needed and maybe pull back that information so the subcommittee at least has it to look at if it's not available now, because there have been a number of studies. The other thing I wanted to mention, the board was unable to meet. I understand that with all the conditions that were going on. I did have two questions, and maybe they're not something the policy board does, but I'm not sure. Which group appoints the PRT, I guess, is one question.
The board normally nominates and approves the PRT members, so we can do that through an email vote, because we'll have to do the FMP review through an email vote as well, because we had that on the agenda prior to the slashing and burning of boards and agenda items. So we can do that there or at the next board meeting, Rob.
Follow up, Rob?
Yeah, thank you. That'll be fine. I did want to mention that the reason I'm bringing that up is because we're heading towards a situation where it's going to be very important to have an engaged PRT as one thing, and we also still have that addendum 2, which still is referenced, and maybe that needs some change as well, so that's why I brought it up.
Yeah, just from my perspective, and I have brought this up numerous times. I'm aware of the data that are available and the studies that have been done. I'm not sure that they're fully answering the question, just because of what we are seeing in the South Atlantic. And certainly I think there should be information from CMAP and from, information from the other southern states as to what they're seeing. I mean, what I'm hearing anecdotally is very positive in the South Atlantic. What I'm seeing firsthand in North Carolina is really nothing short of remarkable. The number of fish and the size distribution of fish that are occurring in our area. And I'm not making these statements and claims in order to try to harvest more fish. My big concern at this point is the discards that we're seeing and how reliable any future stock assessment is going to be when I know that the one fish and the 100-pound bycatch allowance is resulting in tremendous quantities of discards, particularly in our recreational fishery. And we are working on a for-hire logbook right now, but one of the main focuses that folks have been responding back to us on from the for-hire sector is, well, if we're able to show you in our logbooks that we're catching and releasing over 100 gray trout in any single trip while fishing for speckled trout, is that going to help us? Is that going to give you the information you need to go to ISFMP and try to relax some of these restrictions so that we can go make a trip on them and leave them alone? So it's been a problem in North Carolina for several years now. Something's going on north and south of Hatteras. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that something's happening. So whether or not we can parse it out in the stock assessment and whether a formal term of reference or a formal review by the technical committee is going to provide us with any specific information, there needs to be some level of ability to take these issues into account and try to avoid some of this waste that's occurring. And I hope you guys start seeing them up north, and some of those fish move up there, but they seem to be staying south of Hatteras and not moving into the area north, and that just tends to suggest to me that you've got separate populations. I've always thought makes sense with the closure south of Hatteras to fly nets, with all the bycatch reduction devices that have been implemented by the South Atlantic states. You'd expect to have seen some differences. Why you're not seeing good recruitment in producer areas north of North Carolina, I don't even have a clue as to why that may be. So it's a big issue for us, and I appreciate the board's indulgence in letting me go off on a little bit of a tangent there, but I'm encouraged by the move forward, the terms of reference, and the technical committee's review of this, and hope we'll have something that we can maybe start to answer some of these questions in the near term. What we'll need is, if there's no further questions regarding the terms of reference, we will need a motion to approve the terms of reference to move forward. Is there such a motion, Rob?
Yes, I will move to approve the terms of reference, both for the Stock Assessment Subcommittee for weak fish as well as for the peer review panel for weak fish.
Thank you, Rob. Motion from Rob O'Reilly, a second by Roy Miller to approve the terms of reference. Any discussion on the motion as it's put up on the board?
Perfection to the words, just to move to.
Yeah, if it's all right if we just strike the word subcommittee, Rob, for clarification.
Yes.
Any discussion on the motion? Any objection to the motion? Seeing none, the motion carries. Thank you very much. Is there any other business to come before the policy board? Seeing none, we stand adjourned. And